3:30 p.m. Pacific Time.
Next on C-SPAN, we continue with this evening's live viewer call-in programs. Our guest, Ron Paul, presidential nominee of the Libertarian Party. He joins us to talk about his presidential campaign and to respond to your questions and comments.
Ron Paul, you are the Libertarian Party's candidate for President of the United States. With 7 days left to Election Day, what are you doing to get your message out?
Well, giving as many talks as I can and doing as many interviews as I can, just as I've been doing for more than a year. And one thing I've noticed is we are getting more coverage and the rallies are bigger, so we felt pretty pleased with the way things are going. Somebody said, all I need is 6 more months and we'd be right in there.
What do you consider the greatest accomplishment of this campaign for you?
I think it's the fact that we've reached millions of people, more people than we've ever reached before. The organization is bigger than before, and I think we're going to get more votes than ever before. We're building a party, and we've had already tremendous achievement this time. We're the 3rd largest party, the most rapidly growing party. We feel very good about the way it went this year. Of course, we've had 2 great recruiters. Bush and Dukakis has done a great job for us this year, so we felt pretty pleased with how things worked out this year.
Now, what do you mean by that?
Well, people are, are turned off. I mean, the polls every day come out about, each time they did a debate, there were more people who were unhappy with the other 2 candidates. I mean, the New York Times not too long ago reported that 62% of the people weren't satisfied with their choices. And the statistics show that not too many people are going to go out and vote. It's just too bad that if we could get the proper exposure or had any kind of competition with money, when you realize the other 2 parties get $100 million of taxpayers' money, it's pretty rough overcoming those obstacles. But this certainly would be the year when the people hear our message. They're very pleased with it. I'm totally convinced that our message would be received in an equal fashion with the other 2 parties if we would have had the same amount of exposure and money.
So when the voters walk into the voting booth next Tuesday, will they see your name on the ballot?
They will in just about every state. We've missed it on 3 states. In those states they can write in the name, but we're on 47 state ballots as well as the District of Columbia.
Good evening once again. Ron Paul is the Libertarian Party's candidate for President of the United States. He's joining us this evening to talk about his campaign. He was also a member of Congress for 4 terms, Republican from Houston, Texas, and a member of the Banking Committee while he was in the House. He has served as the House sponsor of the U.S. Gold Commission, co-author of its Minority Report. He's a founder of the Council for Monetary Reform. Was chairman of the Committee to Abolish the Fed, editor and publisher of the Ron Paul Investment Letter, and is a practicing physician. Welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
We invite your calls as always, so please do join us to talk about this campaign year. Mr. Paul, what is your message?
Our message basically is that government is too big, and government's role should be different than the role it's performing today. It should be much closer to what was intended by the founders of the country, and it should conform with the Constitution. The role of government ought to be for the protection of liberty, not for the intrusion in our private lives, not for the intrusion in economic affairs, and not to intrude in the internal affairs of other nations. Both of the other parties, both the Republicans and Democrats, have accepted a different role for government, quite contrary to what was intended by the Constitution. They accept a notion that government should interfere in the marketplace, interfere in our private lives, and also both parties have been interfering in the internal affairs of the other nations throughout this century. And we think the role of government should be quite different, and that's what we're trying to do, is to revive the spirit of liberty in this country.
You were talking about press coverage a little earlier. Why didn't you receive as much coverage from the press as Mr. Dukakis and Mr. Bush?
I guess the people who didn't give us the coverage have to answer that question. I don't really know, but I think we've done quite well when we go into the individual cities. I think we are handled fairly. I think on the national media, obviously, we haven't been. But, you know, there are some advantages. I mean, certainly opportunity to come on C-SPAN has been an advantage to a party like ours. And 50% of the people now in the United States do not just sit and watch the three majors. So the use of cable and C-SPAN and video cassette recorders and different things like this have been, the electronic age obviously is a benefit to parties like ours who have the disadvantage, not only the fact that the other two parties have the public funding, the monopoly control of the system, but also the fact that we have to spend so much energy getting on ballots. You know, a lot of our money and time and energy for a whole year is spent just getting on ballots. And of course, the League of Women Voters weren't too happy the way the debates were controlled, you know, so the two parties had to get together and monopolize the debate. So it's a bad trend. It's harder to get a third party going in this country than in most countries of the world. But in spite of those obstacles and the difficulties, I think we've done real well, and I think we've reached a lot of people, and the message is a very, very powerful message, and the people are looking for something. So with those conditions, although not perfect, we still feel like we've reached a lot of people.
With Ron Paul, we go to the phones. Greenwich, Connecticut. Good evening.
Good evening, Dr. Paul. First I have a question. I was wondering, I plan to vote for you, but I was wondering how the Libertarian Party is coordinating its efforts toward, you know, Senate candidates, particularly in Connecticut. I guess I'm probably going to be voting for Howard Grayson because I don't like Lowell Weicker or Joe Lieberman. So I was just wondering, I've heard very little about Mr. Grayson. I was wondering how your party is coordinating the effort to bring out the vote for local candidates.
Thank you.
Well, our national campaign for the presidency cannot coordinate the Senate races, and usually the state parties are handling this. Overall, we have over 500 people running for office. A state like Alabama, it's interesting, we have more congressional candidates on the ballot in Alabama than the Republicans do. So we have a lot of candidates. I couldn't even give you the exact number of Senate candidates, but this would be more handled by you know, the local states, and people who are getting ready to vote should do their own checking on finding out whether we do have Senate and congressional candidates. We have about 220 congressional candidates, so we don't have a candidate in every district, but it's a growing number, and of course we now have over 105 people in office in this country at the lower level. So it is a very solidly based, growing party, and I think a lot of people are going to see a lot of Libertarian names on their ballots this year.
Fort Walton Beach, Florida. Good evening.
Good evening. I'd like to ask Mr. Paul there about what he thinks the effect towards his party siphoning off votes towards like Michael Dukakis, since he's the major party, and hurting him against George Bush, who seems to have it locked up now.
Well, George, you know, there's a couple ways you can look at that. You know, if I'd happened to take some of Bush's votes away from him and George Bush got in because of that, the only regret I might have is that I might have saved the Republican Party from themselves, because we're going to have a very bad financial crisis in this country, and George Bush and the Republicans will be blamed. So in a way they might thank me for it, but that's not likely to happen. Looks like Bush may just get in office. But now if he's well ahead, at least the good conservatives of this country who know that George Bush is not a conservative, at least they can, with their clear conscience, you know, vote for the Libertarian candidate and vote for less government, and they don't have to hold their nose and vote for the lesser of two evils, because the race is not that close. So I think that people should do what they feel good about, and I know a lot of people saying, I'm not voting for George Bush, but I just think maybe Dukakis is a little bit worse. We as Libertarians don't see the difference. You know, if you look at the deficits under Ronald Reagan or the accommodations to the Soviets, it's every bit as much or worse than what the Democrats are doing. So there's really no difference. And this argument that there's one, the lesser of two evils, is not true. Both of them endorse the same concept of government. They spend money, they regulate the economy, they regulate our lives, they police the world. The only thing I think the people ought to do is look to voting for something positive, and to us that's voting for liberty, and that means voting Libertarian.
Linwood, Washington is next. Good evening.
Yes, it's a pleasure to talk to you, Mr. Paul.
Thank you.
I would like to vote for you, but I'm wondering why a vote for you would not be a vote for Dukakis, since it would take a vote away from George Bush, and I think Bush may be the lesser of two evils there, and that's why I would be choosing him, although I don't think he's a true conservative. If enough conservatives voted for you, may give it to Dukakis, so we'd have the worst choice available. I'd also like to know, since there are so many vested interests in our country that are dependent upon our big federal government, Social Security recipients, military-industrial complex, do you feel that the system has enough people on the take, so to speak, so that a person like yourself that would be for individual freedoms, which I respect, wouldn't really have a chance to be elected in this country? Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I basically answered the first part. I think the real wasted vote is voting for either Dukakis or Bush because they endorse the same concept of government, and voting and getting Bush in means that he just might get blamed for all the problems. But I don't see there's any benefit at all whatsoever not to to vote either for Bush or Dukakis. And his second part of his question was...
He was asking about there are so many people on the take.
Oh, yeah, and that's an important point. This whole thing, I think it's the critical point. I think most people vote, unfortunately, in this century, basically, they have been voting for materialistic means. They say, well, I'm going to get something from government. And most of the welfare, goes to the wealthy, not to the poor. The poor get thrown a few crumbs, but they're always looking for something. They're not voting for a principle. And the majority of the American people are getting something off government. So we would like to argue that on moral principle they shouldn't do it. And we'd like to argue that constitutionally it's not authorized. We'd like to argue that welfare systems and warfare systems really never work, they backfire. But the reason why we are now being considered so seriously is the economic conditions are different. The American people are starting to wake up and realize that they can't make these promises anymore because of economic law. The country's broke, the dollar is weak, we've consumed our wealth, we've borrowed to the hilt. So when the other two candidates gets on the air and they say, hey, don't worry about Social Security, Medicare, we'll give you this, more socialized medicine, more tanks, more military, well, the American people look at it and they just don't believe it because of economic law, because they know we're broke and the deficits are so high. They tell you the deficit's $155 billion a year, but if you look at it, the national debt, because they borrow from all the Social Security and other trust funds, the national debt went up last year $238 billion. So that's the reason they'll have to quit the handout business, and they'll have to look to us because we talk about the principles that allow us to produce. The other two parties only talk about how you hand out the loot.
Chicago, Illinois, good evening.
Good evening, Ms. Collins. Good evening, Dr. Paul. I don't have a question so much as a comment. I've been a registered libertarian for 8 years and hope to be for the rest of my life. And I often get told by people when they ask me why I'm voting for a libertarian that I'm throwing my vote away and that it's not going to do me any good. And I'd like to say to people out there who get approached with this question that there's too often elections are looked at as a lottery where there's a winner and a loser, and the lesser of two evils is still evil. And I always feel extremely good when I leave a voting booth after voting Libertarian because I feel I've actually done something to make a statement. And if no one ever votes for Libertarians, they'll never get a chance to get on the ballot and to win in the future. So we are building a party, we're building a base, and we're making a statement that I hope people will notice as they see those numbers go up every quadrennial election or even in the local elections. And so I just want to say to people that think that you have to vote for one of the two parties, that is what perpetuates the two parties. And that's what keeps the media only giving the two parties the coverage, and that it takes people getting out and making a stand against that inherent doctrine of two parties to make a difference. And if you have any comments on that, I appreciate hearing it. But good luck in the campaign.
Thank you. Yes, I think the only way you can avoid wasting your vote is voting Libertarian. The valuable vote is voting, much more valuable if you're voting with a smaller group of people. Percentage-wise, it has that much more value. But if you want to send a message, that's the only thing you can do. If you're satisfied with the type of government we have and you're unconcerned about the monetary system or the tax system or the deficits or the foreign policy, you really don't have anything to do. You can stay at home, you can vote Republican, you can vote Democrat, absolutely no difference. But if you want your vote to really count, if you want to send a message to Washington and say you're sick and tired of it all, and that you'd like to vote for something, something for once, and you don't want to just hold your nose and vote for the lesser of evil, then you vote Libertarian. Vote for a principle, and that vote will count. You know, for us to get between 5 and 10% of the vote is going to be a wonderful message to this country. They'll know that we're here to stay. We've been around for 17 years, and we are going to be a major force in the 1990s, and this is the year to prove it.
Jacksonville, Florida, you're on the air.
Yes, Mr. Paul. I've read a lot of your books before in the past, on especially the job you've done with the Federal Reserve System. You're one of the very few people I ever found out to tell the truth about it. That book, A Primer on Money, which happened to have gotten lost and many people didn't get to read it, I think was a fine job and very truthful. It's a shame the news media, CBS, ABC, and NBC won't give you or your party any kind of coverage. But I'm thinking seriously of voting for either you or George Bush, and I'm glad C-SPAN at least let you on. I wish you'd come out harder on the Federal Reserve, because it is going to take us to a big licking in the early 1990s. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, you've given me the opportunity. We campaign pretty hard against the Federal Reserve because money is one half of every transaction. Therefore, anybody who can manipulate money can manipulate the entire economy. And you and I can't counterfeit, or if we counterfeited the money, we'd go to jail, rightfully, because we would be committing fraud. But it's amazing to me that we delivered to the politicians and to the bankers through Congress and the Federal Reserve System the right to commit fraud, to counterfeit the money, to create money and credit out of thin air. But it was necessary for this to happen to perpetuate big government. Conservatives like big government for one reason, and liberals like big governments for another reason. So they get together and they always collude and they raise both. That's why the deficits are uncontrolled. Then they take these deficits, they deliver them to the Fed creates the credit, the interest rates go up, the inflation rate goes up, and who suffers? The poor people, the middle class, fixed income people, not the people who receive the money first, not the politicians who get reelected. The Federal Reserve is a system of money that should go. We do not need it. We shouldn't have it. It's not authorized by the Constitution. The first attempt at a central bank was stopped by Thomas Jefferson. The second attempt to have central banking was stopped by Andrew Jackson. And I guess it's going to take a libertarian president to stop the next or the last central bank, and that is the Federal Reserve System.
Seattle, you're on with Ron Paul.
Yes, I'd like to know how, Mr. Paul, if you were elected, you would deal with the Democratic and Republican Congress who would vote against all of your projects, especially projects that would consider cutting welfare, the FBI or the CIA, and bringing our troops back home.
Well, I think that's a good question, and obviously when we have a libertarian president, we're going to have a much more libertarian sentiment in the country and libertarian ideas in the Congress. But even today, under today's circumstances, it's best to have a libertarian president and a libertarian approach to the problems that we face. Because instead of being opposed to everybody in Congress, you can go as a libertarian president and work with everybody in the Congress. Today, if you have a conservative president who decides, like Ronald Reagan, to spend a couple $1 trillion during an 8-year period building up the military for who knows what reason, other than building up the military-industrial complex, yes, how does he get that? Well, he has to continue the welfare spending. So they get together and make an agreement, and the liberals and the conservatives agree, and they raise both. The libertarian goes to the conservative and say, look, do you think there's too much waste in the welfare system? And they say, yes, they would support my vetoes there. And what about the liberal? They would say there's too much waste and fraud and too much of corruption in the Pentagon. So they would support me there. So it's that is the only approach that is a sensible approach, even in today's circumstances, to bring some sanity back to the government. I mean, this idea that we can spend $238 billion a year we don't have is going to come to a screeching halt. That's what the stock market crash was all about. So it's very necessary that we approach these solutions from a libertarian perspective.
We go next to Grand Rapids, Michigan. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I have two comments that are actually questions because I would like your opinion of the comment. One, it seems to me that we do need to ultimately end up with two people running in a federal election. But that does not mean that we couldn't have state runoffs and or regional runoffs leading to two final players, so to speak. Now, the reason for that is that we do need a majority ultimately. And I wonder what you think of that. My second comment or question. Earlier today, I listened to Phil Donahue, who was meeting in a city in Ohio, the Fernald city, where the energy facility is. And John Glenn and the governor of Ohio were also with him at that meeting. Now, it came up that a citizen group, is suing, apparently, the federal government for hiring Westinghouse to put that facility in, or else the citizen group is suing Westinghouse because the citizens cannot sue the federal government. Now, the federal government is, in fact, me and you and the citizens. And apparently Westinghouse was hired, of course, as a contractual agent and has made a profit during the duration of this energy facility as it was being built. Now, why could not that, say the nuclear energy, and possibly some other companies in the country be owned by the citizens? I don't mean socialism, and yet that speaks a bit like socialism. But nuclear power, which runs our defense system, if the profit motive is out of that, then I think we have a different ballgame. If you take heat, people that need heat, if the profit motive is out of that and the citizen becomes the stockholder rather than a profit person or stockholding group, then the whole legal picture is a little bit different. And I would like your comment on each of those. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure I understand entirely that problem there in Ohio, but certainly I don't think that we should have collective ownership. I don't like the government involved. Nuclear energy is a good example of how government can really mess something up. First, you have the conservative approach that says the government should do all the R&D, provide the insurance, regulate the fees and the charges, and then dispose of the waste. And that's a subsidy, and that's artificial, and therefore you artificially promote nuclear energy. And then the liberals come along and say, oh, this is horrible, we have to stop it, and they put all the roadblocks in it, and they bring it to a crashing halt. And therefore, we spend tens of billions of dollars on nuclear energy, and we still don't know whether it's safe and efficient. And we don't want the government involved in those things. We want it done by private ownership. So, and we like profit motives. Profits help tell us whether these things are feasible or not. If nuclear power is dangerous, there won't be any insurance and they won't be able to function. So this would sort things out much more so than political lobbying. We don't want the Jane Fondas of the world or some big business who's going to make a lot of money because of special subsidies. We don't want them controlling the law. We want the marketplace to control it. The profit motive would help sort this out. Now, in the other area, you said that you would just assume that we should have only two choices. Well, what is sacred about that? That is how we've been conditioned, I guess, for 50 or 60 years or longer, that we should always have two choices. There's nothing wrong with three choices, so I'd like to see two choices. I don't think you have two choices. I think you only have one choice. You have the choice between two statists, between two people who believe in the use of government force to bring about all these changes in the economy and the regulation of our lives and policing the world. And so two would be fine with me under today's circumstances, but there should be nothing sacred about two choices. Other countries function with 2 and 3 and 4 different parties, and we happen to think that should be part of the American tradition. Certainly the founders of this country didn't indicate that there should be two parties. Matter of fact, they were very leery of political parties, let alone legislating through taxes in order to finance a sacred two-party system. Very, very dangerous.
Tampa, Florida is next. Good evening.
Okay. Yes, first of all, let me tell you, Dr. Paul, that I had the pleasure of voting for you in your very first congressional election when I lived in Texas.
Thank you.
I do have to admit, however, at this time, I am planning not to vote for either of the major party candidates. I'm going to write in the name of Colonel Charles E. Sheldon, who is still listed as a prisoner of war in Southeast Asia. I'm a Vietnam veteran, and many of us veterans are highly upset because neither the Republicans nor the Democrats will make an issue of the fact that there still are alive Americans in Southeast Asia. There have been reward offers, and there's been a lot of activity on this that's been covered up quite a bit because of CIA's the drug running, the Iran-Contra thing and all. A lot of heads will roll, but there are still living Americans there, and neither the Republicans nor the Democrats will make this an issue. What is the position of the Libertarian Party on the men that are still remaining in prisoners in Southeast Asia?
Well, I think we're the only ones who have seriously considered doing anything that might help, and that is changing our foreign policy. It's the foolishness of the interventionist foreign policy that creates the unbelievable situation that occurred in Vietnam. The hostages, which is an utter tragedy in the Mideast, get a lot more attention than those individuals who may be held hostage in Southeast Asia. The only way these problems can be solved is that we address foreign policy so that we can prevent it. But if we change our policy and our attitude, actually, you know, today we're on better terms with South Vietnam now than we were 15 years ago. So there's been some progress there, but when we were imposing our will, when we used our CIA over there to help murder Diem and manipulate the war and escalate the war, that's the thing that we want to stop. We want to prevent the problems. But if we go to these countries, whether it's Southeast Asia or the Mideast, and say, look, we're not going to mess around with you anymore. We're not going to pick sides, and we're not going to keep funding your enemies. We're just going to quit. Then I think you have a much better chance getting the real truth out about the hostages and the missing in action.
Seattle's next. Please go ahead.
Hi, what are your future political ambitions, Congressman Paul? Are you going to run again as a congressman or again as a president in 1992?
Well, I have to wait till November 8th to find out what the results are, and then I have to make a decision. No, I haven't made any long-term decisions. I'm obviously very intense about these issues and about this philosophy and about the party. I will continue in political action, both in the Libertarian Party as well as in education along these lines. But as far as making a decision, this would be a bad time to ask me about running for something right now after almost 2 years of this.
What do you sense young voters are looking for right now?
Straight answers. That's all young people want, straight answers. And that's why, you know, I had one young man out of the University of Iowa. He had met all the candidates, you know, last winter. And he says, I met every single Republican, every single Democrat, and he joined our campaign. I said, well, why was that? He says, you're the first candidate that ever gave us a straight answer. That's what young people want. They'll argue and fuss and challenge you. They're great because they're more concerned about principle. But when they look at it, then they'll respond and to us, because we will give them straight answers and we can give them a concise philosophy and be consistent with it.
Silver Spring, Maryland is next. Please go ahead.
Yes, good evening, Dr. Paul. I have a couple questions on foreign policy. Over the last 8 years, we've had more young men come home in body bags since the Vietnam War. And I want to ask you, how is it that both political parties, the Democrats and Republicans, I guess, make it the assumption that it is our role to intervene in countries at our will? And also, could you talk a little bit about our relationship with our various puppet regimes around the world? If you look over the last 30 or 40 years, a lot of these regimes are very corrupt and they end up getting thrown out, and we end up in a position worse than we had started out with. So if you could talk a little bit about our interventionist policies and our relationship with our puppet dictators around the world. Thank you.
Well, I certainly think it's about the most foolish policy any government could ever follow, and it leads to the Korea Wars, the Vietnam Wars, Marines being killed in Beirut, sailors being killed in the Persian Gulf, us bombing for evening news, Libya, just to prove our macho image. I mean, that is just an outrage. And then, whose policy is it? It's Woodrow Wilson's foreign policy, basically. And both Republican and Democrats have followed ever since then, which means that we are so pompous and arrogant and insecure that we have to impose our will. Take, for instance, the Philippines. The Philippines, last week, they raised our rent. They blackmailed us to the tune of $1.5 billion just to stay there. So what have we been doing? We have been pumping tens of billions of dollars into the Philippines, taking care of them, and then they put us through extortion in order for us to stay. But who got the benefit? Marcos. And Marcos was the friend of Republicans and Democrats for decades. But what are we doing now? We're suing Marcos to try to get a couple bucks back. Whether it's Marcos or Batista in Cuba or a puppet regime under Somoza in Nicaragua, or whether it's the Shah, it leads to trouble. We shouldn't do it because it's morally wrong. We shouldn't do it because it's not authorized in our Constitution to meddle. And we shouldn't do it because it always backfires on us. But we can't do it anymore because we're broke. So I think it's time the American people woke up and said, look, let Japan pay for their own national defense. We don't have any money. They have a strong economy. We take care of them. They lower their taxes, subsidize their exports, and we suffer. Europe. We've been defending Europe since World War II. We put $138 billion a year into Europe. We have 500,000 personnel over there, and their GNP is bigger than ours. And we don't have more security because of it. I feel less secure when they kill Marines in Beirut and we send our navies into the Persian Gulf, or we talk about what we do with the CIA, whether it's at the Bay of Pigs or South Vietnam or Nicaragua. The CIA has no business doing this. The CIA should be out of the business of running secret wars. The Congress should know what's going on. This nonsense that the President has complete and absolute control of foreign policy is nonsense. It's just something that's been concocted by the other two parties. Read the Constitution carefully and we'll find out that Congress has the most to say. They have the right to declare war and raise the army and spend the money. The President can sign treaties and that's about it. And he's a commander-in-chief. But he does not have the right to wage war. A libertarian government would certainly be different than the type of government we've had for the last 70 years. There certainly would be less war.
Jackson, Mississippi, you're on the air.
Good evening, Dr. Powell.
Yes, you have him. Go ahead,
Good
please.
evening.
I want a two-part question. First of all, the history of third parties in the United States has been that they are usually absorbed one of the two major parties. And I wonder what do you think is a possibility that at some time in the future possibly the Libertarians may, say, be absorbed by the Republicans? And also then secondly, you were a Republican up until last year, and I'm wondering exactly why you decided it was time to leave the Republican Party, and if maybe you don't think you should have hung in there a little bit longer and maybe tried to get your views across and change the Republican Party.
I've had no second thoughts. I feel very comfortable with my decision of leaving. I maybe should have left a little sooner. That's about all, because I did. I worked hard when no other elected official in Texas would stand up for Ronald Reagan. I did, because he gave pretty good speeches, talked about getting government off our backs, even quoted libertarian economists like Mises. So I was encouraged that something would be done, but it was only... I quit after 6 years of Reagan. I could have quit 6 days after him, because very early in the administration I knew it was going to continue. The spending continued. He ran on the program of getting rid of the Department of Education, Department of Energy. And what did he do? He created 2 new departments. I mean, nothing ever changes. Some of the worst growth of government occurs under Republicans. So I don't think there's any doubt in my mind that it had to be done outside another party, outside the other two parties and within the Libertarian Party. We have to have somebody who believes in something. We have to have a party of principle that believes in the principles of the Constitution. So I made my move and made my decision and said that no longer would the Republicans ever be believable. You know, if Ronald Reagan gave those wonderful speeches and he swayed me and nothing happened except it got worse, whoever in the world believes George Bush, who never even pretended to be a conservative, where in the world, whoever believes he would do anything about cutting back on the budget? I mean, that's why the people are laughing at this whole thing. That's why half the people are staying home and half the people who are planning on voting are still uncertain about the candidates. I mean, because they're not believable. Now, the other question is a serious question on the third party. Because certainly Norman Thomas sent us a message. When he decided not to run the last time, they said, Mr. Thomas, why aren't you going to run? He says, well, the Republicans and the Democrats accepted 19 out of my 20 points in my program. So if the Republicans and Democrats accept 19 out of our 20 points, I don't think the Libertarians are going to lose a lot of sleep. But we don't operate that way. I don't happen to have a whole lot of confidence that we're going to libertarianize the Republican or the Democratic Party, and that we better have another party. This is, you know, it's not impossible. It's going to be difficult. But certainly in 1856, nobody dreamed that the Republicans would be a dominant party and win the White House. They were dealing with a very serious problem then, slavery. We're dealing with a very serious problem this time. Not only an economic crisis on our doorstep, but slavery again. The enslavement of those individuals who produce by those who do not produce. So it's a new form of modern slavery, and the issue is the same. I believe the American people will look to our party. I work with the assumption that the party will grow and build and be a dominant party. If that does not come about, and I cannot predict the future, but we do restore liberty to this country, I won't lose any sleep over it.
Thousand Oaks, California, good evening.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
I had a little complaint first before I get into my question here. I think C-SPAN's taking too many calls from the East, you know. I don't consider Florida and Maryland and all those other states, you know, as part of the West, and I think the West we're getting sort of cheated here and getting into your show. And another complaint I had, several times I've called into C-SPAN here, for some reason somebody's clicked me off the line and I lost my turn and I had to go through the whole thing again, couldn't even get through on the line there. And I don't know what the problem is with that, but it's about 3 times now that's happened to me.
Yeah, I don't know what that problem is either, but we'll certainly look into that. As far as the East Coast, West Coast thing goes, we alternate.
Yeah, but you haven't been. You've had about three calls from the east, I think Florida, Maryland, and some other state, and then you hit somebody from Seattle or something like that, you know.
Well, if that's happening, I apologize. I haven't been taking that close attention, but we'll keep a watch on that. Go ahead with your question.
What I was wanting to comment on was, like, he always, third-party candidates, I've voted third-party candidates several times, and they always say, well, you know, we get great coverage locally here, but they never get any coverage nationwide, you know, and it's just like, not necessarily so much the Libertarian Party this time because they didn't make all 50 ballots, but that black lady, Leilani, she made the ballot in all 50 states, and they, you know, she's getting the total news blackout on the national network, and you can't run a national campaign for president and not get coverage nationwide, otherwise you're not going to get any part of the vote, you know, and that's just like the Greenpeace Party there in Germany, you know, that's a third party that came on, but it's basically a leftist, socialist type party there, and the news media just ate them all up, you know, give them all kinds of coverage there, and then they've won some elections there in Germany. If they did this, give the same kind of fair coverage to all the third parties in the United States, whether it's conservative or liberal, they would probably be some conservative third party congressmen and some liberals and the different minor party candidates, you know. And the question I had for Ron Paul was, the only thing I don't like about the Libertarian Party is that I've been to several of your meetings and I've raised this point, is the fact that, you know, you seem to be for open immigration and stuff. And I live in California and I see what, and I mean, you know, I'm not just picking on the Mexicans out here. I mean, we got people from India and then every place else in the third world coming across here. And down the border of San Diego, they've been catching more people from Eastern Europe coming across the border down there than they have Mexicans lately, you know. And I think that's going to destroy the country. And the second point I don't like about the Libertarian Party is I think you guys are sort of naive on your world policies. If you take all our forward bases away and bring all our military stuff back to the United States there, you know, you're going to let communism, you know, run loose in the world there, and we're not going to support any of the, you know, freedom movements in the third world countries. You know, I'd like to kind of, you know what you're.
Okay.
Thanks.
Well, I think that there's a lot of deception going on about foreign policy. You know, we have to stop the evil empire. But at the same time, we're supposed to spend $300 billion a year policing the world and stopping the spread of communism. We have a president that signs a treaty that invites the Soviet Union to come over here and inspect our bases. But not only that, the most important thing about that treaty is it's opened up the door for us to bail out a failed system. Communism isn't working. They're turning toward capitalism. They can't feed themselves. They didn't win in Afghanistan, and Europe's about in revolt against the Soviet Union, and we're sending them money to bail them out. So you're not fighting communism. You're fighting the military-industrial complex. You're fighting subsidies to the communists. At the same time, they tell you got to go to Nicaragua and fight against the spread of communism. We have honored a commitment. All the presidents have honored a commitment made by Kennedy for us never to touch Castro. 90 miles off our shore, much closer than Ortega and much tougher. But if you organize in Florida for the overthrow of Castro, you're arrested. So there's a lot of fallacies going on and a lot of deceit, and we just don't think that you're getting the straight story. Now, as far as immigration goes, there's a lot of immigration problems, but it's because this economy is a mess and people get fearful and frightened for unnecessary reasons. But one of the things you have to realize, as soon as you make something illegal, you raise the cost and increase the value of it. So if a Mexican citizen comes up here because he wants to help us, that is, pick the crops and do the things that literally raises our standard of living, where a lot of Americans won't do these jobs, does he go back home and help his family? No, he's scared because we have guns at the border. So he becomes an illegal alien. So literally the law backfires, and we have more illegal aliens. Rather than having workers coming up and freely going back and forth, most people are much more concerned about the movement of people back and forth on Mexico border than a Canadian border. We have tens of thousands of people going back and forth. In a free market economy, a healthy economy, we have a shortage of labor. People who come over and want to work, they help us. They enhance our standard of living. They take the funds back. It's a perfect foreign aid system. Certainly, it's horrible what we do today. We put guns on the border. We won't let them come in to pick the crops. Our prices go up. They don't help the families. Then they tax you, and they take your money, and they send it to the Mexican government, and it never helps the poor people in Mexico.
Columbia, Missouri, good evening.
Good evening. Mr. Paul, I wanted to ask basically two questions, but they both relate to drugs. One is, do you differentiate between drugs in the term do you see a difference between alcohol and marijuana and heroin? And the other is, do you favor action when and if you become influential in the presidential realm, decriminalization or government-regulated legalization?
Thank you.
We don't see any difference between the drugs, and we would decriminalize. The only difference that you could figure out between say the marijuana and some of the other drugs and alcohol and cigarettes is that alcohol and cigarettes are a lot more dangerous because they kill a lot more people. We're losing 450,000 people a year with alcohol and cigarettes, and you and I are being taxed to subsidize the tobacco industry. At the same time, then we spend money telling people not to smoke because they cause cancer. Most of our state governments are in the business of selling drugs, that is alcohol, that kill a lot of people. So we think the drug laws are really foolish. They backfire. They create the drug dealer. They create 50% of the crime. They encourage kids to be involved because they make such big bucks dealing in the drug trade. So we think it's a horrible system, but what we want to legalize is freedom of choice. We think that people ought to have a choice in the matter and make decisions for themselves. We can't protect individuals from themselves, but the laws would, even in a libertarian society, prevent these prohibited the use of drugs by kids and children, because children aren't consenting adults. But the drug laws are devastating, and they've done more harm. They weren't written by the founders of the country. They were only written again same time we had the income tax, same time we had the Federal Reserve System, same time we changed our foreign policy, same time we lost our way in definition of what individual liberty was. In 1914 is when we started telling people they shouldn't smoke and drink. Prohibition of alcohol was a total failure. So we would decriminalize and we would treat the drugs in a similar manner, although we do recognize that the government regulated and subsidized drugs are a lot more dangerous.
St. Louis, Missouri, good evening.
Yes, Dr. Paul. I think one thing most people today agree is that it takes less personal freedom, personal responsibility, to live life. Due to the advent of the regulatory agencies like the FDA, which tells us which is good and bad, and motor vehicle safety, which features on an automobile are good and bad, there are fewer options, and it's responsibility on our part. In the past, culture as a whole has acted as a bank of knowledge, gaining the experience of individuals and families and dispensing it back to us in common sense. And I think a lot of people would like to have something more like that today, but they fear that the world is more complex, more technological. There's too much information out there for that to be adequate. What would the Libertarian Party or government do to perform some of these assistances to society?
All right, thank you. Thank you, sir.
Well, you know, that's a very good point. I think it's true. I think the world is more complex and more technological. Therefore, we need less big government, because big government is a blunderer. I mean, to talk about safety devices from the national level but through a bureaucracy doesn't make any sense. So this is the strongest argument I know for having much more local individual control of our lives and making our decisions rather than the federal government. But these agencies backfire. Whether you have an EPA, it turns out to be a welfare system for sewer developers, and it doesn't really protect the environment. Whether you have if you have the FDA, what does it do? It turns our people suffering from AIDS and cancer into smugglers because they can't get the drugs they want, and they go to Mexico, the free country of Mexico, to get drugs. I mean, that's how foolish these things are. They backfire. So it should be regulated through the marketplace, through local, through the rules against fraud, but not through a federal monster.
Dr. Paul, that's all the time we have. Thank you very much for joining us. Ron Paul, running for president as the Libertarian Party's candidate. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your calls, and have a good evening.